In the islands once ruled by gods and warriors, a new power was rising. Her name was Kaʻahumanu, born of chiefs, destined to outthink kings. When Kamehameha forged Hawaii into one kingdom, she stood beside him, silent, watching, learning every move of war and rule. And when the great conqueror fell, the question was no longer who would fight for the throne, but who would rule it. This is Hawaii's Queen, the Queen Kaʻahumanu versus Chief of War. The death of Kamehameha I left Hawaii trembling. For years, his word had been law, a balance of fear, faith, and force. Now, the throne was empty, and the islands waited to see who would claim his shadow. In the silence after the drums, two powers began to move. One was the old order, chiefs who still believed that strength came from blood and battle. The other was something new, a woman who had learned how to rule without raising a spear. Kaʻahumanu had stood beside the conqueror long enough to know his secrets. She understood that power was not taken once. It had to be held, every day, with mind and will. And so began a struggle not of armies, but of ideas. A war fought in whispers, alliances, and royal courts. Chapter 1. The Rise of Kaʻahumanu. She entered the royal court as a young chiefess with sharp eyes and a memory that missed nothing. Where others chased glory and battle, she watched the currents that moved people, gifts, loyalties, jealousies, old vows no one dared to break. As Kamehameha built a kingdom from scattered wars, Kaʻahumanu learned the architecture of power from the inside. She understood who carried real influence: the chiefs who controlled harvests and harbors, the priests who kept the Kapu, the stewards who could quietly redirect canoes, labor, and news. She learned when to speak and when silence could buy a future favor. Marriage bound her to the conqueror, but presence made her indispensable. She read the room of Ali'i like a navigator reads swells. Subtle shifts foretold storms. When disputes rose, she found the single concession that turned enemies into cautious partners. When tempers burned too hot, she cooled them with timing. A postponement, a visit, a feast that let pride walk away with dignity intact. Power in Hawaii was never only a spear, it was protocol. Kaʻahumanu mastered the language of entrances and placements, of who sat where and who was named first. She learned that a public gesture could be more decisive than a private threat. And she kept score, who owed what to whom, until debts could be called in with one carefully chosen request. In the shadow of temples and the drums of victory, she studied limits as closely as strengths. Armies could win battles, but could they hold distant valleys during famine? Priests could declare taboos, but could they reverse a failing season? Each weakness mapped a path for a new kind of rule, one built not on fear alone, but on the coordination of many hands. By the time Kamehameha's great campaigns slowed, Kaʻahumanu had assembled her own invisible network. Trusted attendants, messengers who moved between courts, women of rank who could sway their husbands and brothers, stewards who managed stores and ships. It was not a conspiracy. It was competence, quiet, constant, and underestimated. She did not need to be the loudest voice in council. Influence flowed to her because she made it useful to stand close. Those who dismissed her as a consort discovered, slowly, that decisions now bent around her presence. What began as access became leverage. Leverage, authority. And when the day came that the kingdom's future would depend less on who could strike and more on who could steady the helm, Kaʻahumanu was already there, hands light on the wheel, eyes on the horizon, ready to turn a warrior's empire into a governed nation. Chapter 2. The Chief of War. He was called the Chief of War, a man carved from the old god's image, loyal to the code that had shaped generations of warriors. To him, Kaʻahumanu was not a queen, but a challenge to the order of the world itself. He had fought beside Kamehameha in the island wars, earning scars that spoke louder than words. Where she saw diplomacy as power, he saw it as weakness. Where she built alliances through patience, he trusted only in the strength of arms. Each carried a vision of Hawaii's future, hers bound by reason, his by faith in the ancient Kapu that had guided the chiefs since time immemorial. In councils, their silence was its own battle. She would wait, eyes fixed, letting him speak first. He would stand, voice rising like surf against rock, warning of decay, that women in power would unmake the sacred balance, that the gods would abandon a kingdom led by mortal ambition. But beneath his fury lay fear, not of Kaʻahumanu, but of the change she embodied. He saw the foreigners arriving, the ships, the strange prayers, the tools that could shape both war and thought. He believed these were omens, tests sent by the gods. Kaʻahumanu believed they were opportunities, instruments of survival in a world that would no longer wait for Hawaii to decide its own fate. Between them, the court divided. Old priests whispered that the queen's influence defied the gods. Younger chiefs watched her closely, wondering if perhaps power could be sharper when it did not draw blood. Even Kamehameha's successors hesitated, caught between loyalty to tradition and awe of her control. There were moments when their conflict nearly turned to open war. Rumors spread of armed gatherings in distant valleys, of men who swore they would never bow to a woman's rule. But Kaʻahumanu understood that the strongest walls were not made of stone. They were made of stories. She allowed his threats to echo until they exhausted themselves. Then she acted quietly, removing his allies one by one, through marriage ties, land disputes, or carefully timed forgiveness that turned defiance into debt. The Chief of War, once a hero, began to find himself surrounded by silence. Those who had once shouted his name now listened to hers. He could not understand how power could move without battle drums, how loyalty could shift without a sword being drawn. Yet deep within, he knew she was right. The world was changing, and his kind of strength, the kind that lived and died on the battlefield, could not hold it together forever. He was the last guardian of an age already fading, and she, standing calm amid the storm, was the first architect of what would replace it. Their struggle was never just for a crown, it was for the soul of Hawaii, for what would remain sacred and what would be reborn. Chapter 3. The Battle for the Throne. The throne of Hawaii was never built for peace. When Kamehameha's voice fell silent, his heirs inherited not only a kingdom, but a storm. No map could guide them now, only the unseen currents of loyalty and fear. Kaʻahumanu moved first. She understood that whoever controlled the young king would control the realm. With calm precision, she stepped into the royal court and claimed a title no one had yet imagined. Kuhina Nui, co-ruler. It was not a demand, but a statement. The conqueror's vision would live on through her hands. The Chief of War saw it as betrayal. To him, this was no act of stewardship. It was conquest by another name. He gathered the old warriors, those who still burned incense for the gods of war, those who whispered that no woman could share the throne of a king. In the gatherings of chiefs, he invoked the past, the Kapu system, the sacred laws, the bloodlines that defined right to rule. And yet, the queen's influence reached further than their chants could carry. She understood the language of inheritance, not just of blood, but of legitimacy. She called on the widows of Kamehameha, on priests who owed her quiet debts, and on messengers who traveled between islands spreading a simple truth: that she, more than anyone, understood what the late king had built and what could still destroy it. In court, every glance was strategy, every feast a test. A seat too close to the queen meant allegiance. A delayed invitation meant exile. It was a battle fought without spears, a war of patience and perception. The chief of war countered with strength, assembling his followers in remote valleys, gathering men who longed for the certainty of the old code. But the queen's victories were invisible. A chief's son sent to her service, a rival's marriage arranged, a land grant retracted without public notice. Each move weakened his footing until even his allies began to doubt. At last, the confrontation neither could avoid arrived. Before the Council of Ali'i, she spoke not with rage, but with conviction. She spoke of balance, of a kingdom that must stand united under law, not divided by fear. She offered him dignity, the right to remain a guardian of the old faith, even as the kingdom looked to new ways. It was not surrender she asked for, but adaptation. Yet to him, change was death. He left the council in silence, the air heady with finality. Those who followed him would soon find their cause slipping into memory. The throne did not fall that day. It transformed. Kaʻahumanu had turned battle into governance, warriors into counselors, enemies into witnesses of a new order. The kingdom would survive not because of the wars it had won, but because of the one it would never need to fight again. For the first time in Hawaii's history, power no longer wore armor. It spoke softly, and everyone listened. If this story pulled you in, subscribe and join us for the next chapter. Facts first, mystery intact, every week. Next, Faith and Fire, how one decision ended centuries of Kapu and set Hawaii on a collision course with new gods. Chapter 4. Faith and Fire. The drums of war had gone silent, but another battle was coming, one that no spear could win. Across the horizon, sails appeared like white omens. The strangers who stepped ashore carried not weapons but books, and words that promised salvation. To Kaʻahumanu, they looked less like conquerors and more like a new kind of power, one that ruled through belief. The old priests warned her. They said that to abandon the Kapu, the sacred code, was to invite ruin. For centuries, the Kapu had bound heaven and earth. Who could eat? Who could speak? Who could live? It kept the islands balanced, or so the gods had decreed. But Kaʻahumanu saw another truth, that fear had become the crown Hawaii wore every day. The chief of war and his followers clung to the past. They built fires to the old gods, praying for storms to drive the foreigners away. To them, these pale men were the shadow of extinction, and the queen its herald. But she did not tremble. She had watched the world change once before, under Kamehameha. Now she would change it again, not through conquest, but conviction. She walked into the temple courtyards where generations had bowed in silence, and she spoke the words no ruler before her dared to say. The Kapu is broken. The gasp that followed shook more than the walls. It cracked the spine of the old world. The flames that once burned for the gods now burned the idols themselves. Smoke rose into the blue, carrying centuries of worship into the wind. Some said she was possessed. Others said enlightened. But none could deny what followed. The young king stood beside her, his hesitation swallowed by her certainty. Together they watched as temples fell quiet, drums ceased, and Hawaii took its first breath as something new. Faith and fire, two forces that had always shaped these islands, now collided in her hands. To destroy the old was to risk the soul of the kingdom, yet to keep it was to chain the future. Kaʻahumanu chose the path of flame. When the missionaries knelt before her, reading from their foreign book, she listened, not as a servant of their God, but as a sovereign testing the strength of another empire's faith. In their words, she heard both danger and promise, that ideas could travel farther than armies. And in that moment, she understood what every ruler must, that power does not vanish, it only changes form. The gods of stone had fallen, the gods of ink had arrived, and standing between them was a queen who had dared to command both. Chapter 5. The Last Rebellion. The breaking of the Kapu did not bring peace. It brought confusion, and for some, fury. The gods had been silenced, but not everyone believed they were gone. Across the islands, whispers turned to vows. Old warriors gathered again, their drums returning like distant thunder. They carried no foreign words, no written faith, only the memory of the flames that once kept their ancestors' spirits alive. To them, Kaʻahumanu's rule was not liberation, it was blasphemy. The chief of war, though weakened and old, became their symbol once more. His scars were proof of a time when men answered only to the gods of their fathers. He spoke of omens, of earthquakes, of failing crops, of storms as signs that the old spirits demanded vengeance. And the people listened, for fear always listens first. Kaʻahumanu understood the danger. A rebellion of swords she could face. But this was a rebellion of belief, harder to kill than any army. Her advisors urged her to crush it quickly. But she had learned that every victory leaves an echo. To silence them by force would make martyrs of men who no longer mattered. So she chose a different kind of battle. She sent messengers, not soldiers, to the rebel chiefs. She offered them forgiveness if they would lay down their arms, land if they would swear peace. Some refused, shouting that the queen's mercy was poison. But others, weary, hungry, uncertain, began to listen. Still, there were those who would not bend. They built their final camp in the shadows of the mountains, where smoke rose in defiance. The queen's forces surrounded them, yet she ordered no attack. Days passed. The fires burned lower. When at last she rode to the edge of their camp, she came unarmed. The chief of war stood before her, eyes hollow with years of loss. Between them lay everything Hawaii had been, and everything it was becoming. He asked her, "Do you not fear the gods you've betrayed?" She answered, "If they are gods, they will endure without your spears." No one moved. No blade was drawn. And in that silence, the rebellion ended. The old chief turned away, his warriors following him into the forest like shadows dissolving at dawn. Some would say the gods left with them. Others whispered that Kaʻahumanu had conquered not men, but time itself. When the sun rose the next morning, its light touched temples without priests, altars without offerings. The kingdom still stood, But it was not the same kingdom anymore. The fires of rebellion had burned away the last illusions of the past. What remained was something fragile and new. Kaʻahumanu had not only ruled Hawaii, she had remade it. And like all great revolutions, hers began not with conquest, but with conviction. Chapter 6: Legacy of a Queen. History remembers Kaʻahumanu in fragments. A queen, a regent, a reformer, a heretic. But every piece of her story carries the same fire: the will to decide what Hawaii would become. After the last rebellion faded, she ruled not through fear but through order. Her council stretched from island to island, weaving laws that blended tradition with the new faith. She created schools where once there had been silence, laws where once there had been taboo. Her signature began to appear beside that of kings, a quiet testament that power, once seized by men in battle, could now flow through the hand of a woman with vision. Yet her reign was not gentle. She demanded obedience with the same iron that had once shaped the spears of Kamehameha. Those who defied the new laws found their lands stripped, their names forgotten. Her justice was swift, and it was lasting. Some called her savior, others called her destroyer. Missionaries praised her as the chosen vessel of God. Priests whispered that she had traded the soul of Hawaii for foreign salvation. But Kaʻahumanu cared little for praise or blame. She had lived long enough to understand that every change births its own mythology. As years passed, she grew frail but never diminished. From her seat in Lahaina, she watched ships arrive from the farthest corners of the world. Whaling vessels, traders, explorers. Each brought something new: languages, diseases, gods, dreams. And still she ruled, her mind sharp as coral, her heart anchored in the islands she had remade. When she died, the kingdom mourned not only a queen, but an age. The world she had inherited was gone, and the one she left behind was uncertain, a place between memory and modernity. But her name remained, carved into every decision that followed. The abolition of the Kapu, the rise of written law, the first constitution, the education of women, the redefinition of power itself. In time, statues would stand where temples once stood. Church bells would echo where chants had once called to the gods. And through it all, Kaʻahumanu's shadow stretched quietly, not as a ghost but as a question. What does it mean to rule when faith, tradition, and destiny collide? Her story is not merely the story of a queen. It is the story of Hawaii's transformation, from the world of gods to the world of nations. And somewhere between those two worlds, she still stands, half-remembered, wholly unforgotten. Stay with the story. Watch the next film in our Hawaii arc, and tell us your theory in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Facts first, mystery intact. At dusk, the wind over Maui carries a sound that is neither chant nor hymn, a whisper between worlds. It is said that if you listen long enough, you can still hear her name in the rustle of the palms. Kaʻahumanu. Her story does not end with her death, because her shadow still lies across the islands, in the laws, the language, the silence between tides. Every choice she made carved a new shape into Hawaii's heart. Every silence she kept became a boundary between what was sacred and what was lost. The missionaries she once welcomed would go on to reshape the kingdom. Their books would become the kingdom's laws, their prayers its public voice. And yet, Behind every sermon and statute, her presence lingers, the queen who saw change coming and dared to guide it. History often forgets those who stand between ages. It prefers heroes and villains, conquerors and saints. Kaʻahumanu was none of these, and all of them. Her power was not in battle, but in vision. Not in conquest, but in consequence. Today the temples are ruins, the palaces turned to museums. But the question she left behind still echoes. Can a nation change its gods and still remain itself? Perhaps that is why her name endures. Not as a legend frozen in stone, but as a living pulse beneath the soil of Hawaii, where the old world and the new still meet, and where somewhere between them, a queen still rules the wind. Mahalo nui loa I ngā kupuna o Hawaii. Great thanks to the ancestors of Hawaii, whose wisdom still moves through the waves, the mountains, and the hearts of those who listen.
E nā pāli ki ka hae, ala I ka malamalama o ke kakahiaka, e ka makani o ka iaulu.
E ka la e hala wai ana me ke kai, e malamalama I ko maua ala.